when defamation occurs, that it is occurring, and that we will understand the motivations of those who do that, and that we will know who the people are who do those things and how they do it. And that's the only way that we can defend ourselves against these kinds of things.
Do you think we understand how much effort has been put forth to keep this information about ancient Egypt and Nile Valley civilization out of the hands and minds of African people? Do you think we understand?
No, I don't think we have any idea of the mechanisms or the intensity of the effort, how long it's been going on, and the fact that it's still going on. In other words, for example, most of the pictures that I've shown in this slide presentation so far are pictures that most people have never seen before. Not because they weren't there, but the decision was made to use other pictures. The decision to use Nefertiti rather than T is a decision that you have to evaluate in terms of its meaning for Egyptian history or Kemetic history. For example, Queen T was more important than Nefertiti. But Nefertiti stands as the symbol of the typical Kemite. And that has to do with the, I think, the ulterior motives of people who do the research.
Now, how has the writing of history by European writers, historians, helped to promote what some have called the Europeanization of human consciousness?
Well, if the total source of your information is from a group of scholars that comes from one culture, they're imprisoned in their own culture, and most of them even don't have the capacity to stand outside the culture and to view it critically in the first place, and some don't even have the intent to do that. So there's nothing that they can present other than a focus that comes from their own center, which we call European-centered. And if I, as a person who studies, do so uncritically, or if I don't participate in the production of scholarship, raising the kinds of questions and priorities that I need to know about as an African person, a person of African descent, from an African-centered perspective, then there's nothing left for me but a European-centered information base, which will produce in my head a European way of viewing the world, even though I'm a person of African descent.
Let's break it down. How does European consciousness manifest itself in our lives? A couple of examples.
It manifests itself in self-hatred, where African people actually accept the doctrine of white supremacy and believe that white people are superior to black people, so much so that they reject their own historical memories, they reject identification with their brothers and sisters, they reject identification with Africa, they reject identification with African culture. You know, this is literally cultural suicide. And the reason is that it's so painful sometimes to be associated with the kinds of images that are projected about African people, the false images.
When I wrote this question down, I had no idea your answer would be that great.
I didn't know it was that great.
Do you think we realize the extent to which we are controlled by European thinking?
No. You see, the control that we experience is so subtle. It seems natural if a professor has a PhD, is in a prestigious university, and teaches the classics, and I'm a student at that university, and I take this course in the classic. He must know what he's talking about. He has a PhD. This is a great university. It's been here for a long time. So it's natural to go through Homer and never ask the question, what is an Ethiopian? Why did the Greeks call him that? Why did Homer spend so much time studying and talking about Africa? Why was the relationship between Africans and Greeks so good? You see, if I'm not critical, then those kind of thoughts will never occur to me, and that's a very subtle kind of process. We are not aware of that process at all, mainly by virtue of the kind of socialization process that most of us have gone through.
You have said that this is all about a battle for the mind. What do you mean by that?
Of course it is. The question of whether we have the independence to raise our own questions and to project our own priorities. There's a song that many of us remember. Papa may have, blues song, right? Mama may have, but God bless the child that's got his own. So the blues singer understood better than many of our academics that it was essential not to be dependent. Garvey used to say, any people that accepts the ideas of another people automatically will become the slave of that people.
To what do you attribute this need on the part of Europeans, maybe more specifically European scholars, others within the European collective, to put down, belittle the African history?
Well, that's one of the universal rules of oppression. Any group of people that wants to control another group of people must destroy the historical consciousness of that group of people. Dr. John Clark is famous for saying, it is impossible to continue to oppress a consciously historical people. And so oppressors know that. And one of their main military tactics is a historical attack. The erasure, the suppression of history is a military tactic. It's the chief way of disabling a population. And so that is well understood.
What do we mean by African consciousness, and what does it mean in terms of a value system, briefly?
Well, of course, African consciousness would grow out of an intimate knowledge, familiarity with study of the cultural experience of African people. And what comes from that is a point of view. It's unavoidable. If I spend time studying the poetry of my people, the music of my people, the philosophy of my people, the religion of my people, the science and contributions of my people, doesn't mean I have to reject anybody else's science and contributions and so forth. But what it does do for me is it gives me a firm base in my own creativity. And that unavoidably will produce in me an African consciousness. And that's very important. Now, African consciousness is the ethnicity of African people. And there are characteristic values, and I think those are summed up in many ways in some of the work that has been done on the Nguzo Saba, and the seven principles. Sometimes we see associated with Kwanzaa. We're a collective people, for example. We take care of each other. I mean, there are typical cultural traits that people have identified with African people for long periods of time that grow out of our southern cradle environment in the African continent. We welcome the stranger. For example, Cheikh Diop in his book, The Cultural Unity of Black Africa, identified some of these parameters. The fear of the stranger is typical of the northern cradle. The love of the stranger is typical of the southern cradle. The northern cradle being the European, the southern cradle being the African. The Africans always welcome strangers. You could go to Africa, leave your bag, come back 2 years later. If you left books there, they present you with your books when you came back. That is actually an example that comes from the book, The Strong Brown God, by de Grammont, who talks about this explorer Clapperton, and that actually happened to him, where he had left some things and came back 2 years later, and his things were presented to him. That's how welcome he was made to feel. So there are many values. I can't go into all of them, but
this business of a people using the study of history to reclaim its mind, its consciousness. How unique an undertaking is that, and how do we know it will work?
Well, it's not unique at all. In fact, you name me a successful group nationally, and I will name you a group that's invested heavily in the reclamation of its history. One example of that would be German people who, the Grimm brothers, for example, are said to have collected fairy tales in order to reconstruct the ancient history of German people so that they would have a basis for identifying themselves ethnically as a people to mobilize nationally. That happened with the Jewish people and the reclamation of their history and the development of the State of Israel. It's happened with the Japanese people in recent times and so forth. There is no group of people who ever become strong and powerful without an investment in its history.
You have mentioned the positive things that
Yeah.
will flow
Right.
from a study of African history. But are there some negative things that can flow from it?
There are some negative things that can flow. For example, if we allow ourselves to glorify at the expense of truth, in other words, we're so hungry for an appropriate positive identity that we begin to give false meaning or false interpretations to the facts of our experience. So, for example, that we would skip over the negatives in our experience. And see, everything isn't positive about Africa. Some things are positive, some things are negative.
Say that again.
Everything isn't positive about Africa. Nothing is positive totally about any group of people. We have our pluses and we have our minuses like all other people. If I'm blinded by the search for glorification so that I can't honestly appraise what my true experience has been, I will be misguided in the use of history, even though it may feel good. And so that's one of the dangers that, for example, a lot of people talk a lot about we were kings and queens. Yes, we were kings and queens, but we were also ordinary people. We were common folk, and that was just as good as being kings and queens. And we need, if we are going to give value to the experience, to give value to the total experience.
And if you have to feel as though you are a descent of a king or queen, maybe something is wrong. I mean,
something
to feel
is
healthy,
wrong. If that's the only way that you can be ego strong, there's something wrong with that. Right? Yeah.
This history, which shows the greatness of African people,
Right.
frightens some African people.
Right.
How do you deal with that?
Well,
And why do you think that is?
people who are oppressed, they have something called the Stockholm Syndrome that talks about how hostages react after they come out of captivity. That many of the hostages act almost as if they don't want to come out of captivity. And when asked how they were treated as hostages, they start talking about how well they were treated as hostages. In fact, it's called the Stockholm Syndrome because one of the Stockholm hostages married one of their captors. So there was that close an identification and intimacy between those who oppressed and those who were oppressed. So that is very typical oppressed behavior, to lose track of one's moorings and to glom on, so to speak.
So that example says what about the African American experience and the relationship?
That many of us may have become too comfortable with a dependency relationship, and that independence is frightening. That taking on the responsibility associated with making your own choice, that you not only make your choice, but you have to live with the choice that you make. It's sometimes much easier to have someone else take care of you. So
what have you found to be the best way of sharing this information with people who are just now coming into this information?
Well, I only know one way to go, and that's straight ahead. And I found that it's straight ahead. It doesn't hurt anyone. I don't mince words. I don't hold anything back. I talk to the children just like I talk to the adults. And I found that people are amazingly strong and able to pick up the conversation if it's presented to them. I don't think you have to sugarcoat it.
But there are preachers, as you know, there are preachers, let's just mention preachers for a second, who know that the Africans, many Africans, believed in the resurrection.
Right.
But at the same time, and they know but many times they don't want to let their members know this.
Yeah.
How do you?
Yeah, well, see, you have to ask the question how much they know. See, they may know the conclusion, but they may not feel comfortable with the information that supports the conclusion. So when they start telling this story to the congregation, they get lost, not being able to support the kind of thing. See, I've worked with a lot of preachers who have taken this information and have begun to educate their congregation. I mean, this is one of the most remarkable things that I've seen in the last 10 years, is the openness of both congregations. For example, I was in Florida, and there's one minister there, Reverend Carter, who had sat on the front row himself and had his congregation go through a 2-day workshop on this ancient African history and other things, and told them if they didn't come, they were sinners.
All right. By the way, some of my best friends are ministers.
Oh, I thought you were going to say sinners.
No. We got less than 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay.
What are some of the things, briefly, that we need to watch out for where the study of Egyptian Kemetic history is concerned?
Well, you
Quickly,
know,
right now and in the years ahead.
You know, one of the main things is that as people begin to jump on the bandwagon, so to speak, we need to watch out for those who would use this thrust for their own personal ends rather than as a search for truth. Because you find a lot of people who find they can make money, you know, doing things with respect to Egyptian history. And I don't have any problem with people making money, but if we betray the essence of the thrust by making materialism the reason for doing the study of ancient Kemet, that's the thing probably that worries me more than anything else.
Okay. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Always.
Look around you, black child. Your creation is everywhere. Though painted, distorted, given new names, they bear your prints just the same. So sharpen your eyes, tune your ear, so you know what you see, understand what you hear. You were the first to write, the first to read. Humanity sprang from your black seed. For 110,000 years, you were here alone, and then the Caucasian man was born. Behind the ice, inside the cold, a chill set in this new man's soul. Other minds have been credited with the things they learned from you. Newton, Pythagoras, Kepler, and Galileo too. Sharpen your eyes, tune your ear, so you'll know what you see, understand what you hear. You made the serpent the symbol of the healing arts, and African justice was goddess Mat, who weighed herself against the African soul, truth and justice blindfold. The George Washington Monument is yours too, a copy of the African Tekenu, the symbol of the black world's powers of creation, the black man's penis in divine procreation. The king of southern Egypt wore the white crown. Keep listening and you'll catch your mouth when you learn that the central government in Egypt was known as the White House. Sharpen your eyes, tune your ear, so you'll know what you see, understand what you hear. Your god Osiris was restored to life long before Buddha, long before Christ. And today what you call the Madonna and Child is but the first black family worshipped along the Nile. And when you feel the Spirit, the Holy Ghost, you should know it started at Abydos, where god Osiris's body was laid, the Holy Land, where Africans prayed. Minute by minute, hour by hour, as you lose your history, you lose your power. So sharpen your eyes, tune your ear, so you'll know what you see, understand what you hear.